"Sir, you need to get up. This seat isn't yours." The words didn't echo. They cut, sharp and certain, slicing through the quiet luxury of the first-class cabin at 30,000 feet. And for a moment, everything paused, as if the entire plane was holding its breath. Marcus Carter didn't move, didn't even blink, seated calmly in 2A with nothing more than a black t-shirt, dark jeans, and a stillness that felt heavier than the polished leather around him. While Nicole Harris stood in the aisle, posture stiff, smile tight, already convinced she was correcting a mistake that should have never existed. She didn't scan his ticket, didn't ask a question, didn't hesitate, because in her mind, the conclusion had already been made long before she spoke, and behind her, a well-dressed white passenger adjusted his blazer, waiting patiently like the outcome was guaranteed. Marcus slowly lifted his boarding pass between two fingers, not in defense but in quiet clarity, offering it without urgency. But Nicole barely glanced before shaking her head, her voice dropping just enough to sound controlled, just enough to sound like policy. "We have a priority guest. I need you to move to economy." And somewhere across the aisle, a phone tilted upward, someone sensing what this moment really was, not loud, not chaotic, just precise, like a line being drawn without permission. Marcus leaned back slightly, eyes steady, absorbing every detail. The way the crew avoided eye contact, the way the passenger behind Nicole didn't question a thing, the way the air itself shifted from comfort to tension in seconds. And still, he said nothing, because silence, in moments like this, wasn't weakness, it was control. Nicole exhaled through her nose, impatience creeping in, and without warning, she reached out and tore the boarding pass clean down the middle, the rip loud enough to ripple through the cabin like a signal. And that was it. The exact second the atmosphere changed, because now it wasn't about a seat. It was about something deeper, something everyone could feel but no one wanted to name. A young trainee near the galley froze, her hand hovering over her phone before quietly pressing record, while two rows back, a passenger whispered, "Did she even check his ticket?" But no one answered, because the system had already chosen its side. Marcus looked down briefly at the torn halves in his hand, then back up at Nicole, his expression unreadable, not angry, not surprised, just aware, like this wasn't new, like this was a pattern playing itself out again in a different setting. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying farther than it should have. "Go ahead," he said, meeting her eyes without blinking. "Make the call." And Nicole, confident, almost relieved, turned toward the intercom, already reaching for authority she thought she controlled, unaware that in the next few minutes, every decision she was making, every word she was choosing, was being recorded, logged, and quietly handed to someone who didn't just belong in that seat, but owned far more than anyone on that plane was ready to understand. The intercom clicked softly in Nicole Harris's hand, but before she could speak, the silence in the cabin shifted again, heavier now, like something unseen had just entered the room, and Marcus Carter noticed it immediately, not with his eyes, but with the way people began to hesitate, the way small glances turned into longer stares, the way the energy no longer belonged to the crew. Nicole straightened her posture, forcing authority back into her voice as she addressed the cabin. "We are currently handling a seating issue in first class," she said, each word carefully measured, but it sounded thinner now, less certain, because even she could feel that something was not aligning the way it should. Behind her, the white passenger, Richard Bennett, cleared his throat and adjusted his cufflinks, stepping slightly closer to the seat, as if proximity alone would secure it. And yet he did not sit down, not yet, because even he sensed the tension tightening in ways he could not explain. Marcus remained seated, hands resting calmly on his lap, gaze forward, not defiant, not submissive, simply present, and that presence began to draw attention in a way that noise never could. 2 rows back, a woman leaned toward her companion and whispered, "He has not." Raised his voice once, and that observation lingered in the air longer than Nicole's announcement. Near the galley, the trainee, Mia Thompson, swallowed hard as she kept her phone angled low, capturing everything, her training telling her to stay silent, but her instincts telling her something else entirely, something louder than policy. Nicole turned back toward Marcus, her tone tightening again. "Sir, this is your final request. You need to move. But Marcus did not respond right away, not because he did not hear her, but because he was listening to something else, something deeper than her words, the rhythm of the moment, the pattern unfolding exactly as he had seen it before, years ago, in rooms that looked different but felt exactly the same. He shifted slightly in his seat, just enough to reach into his pocket, pulling out his phone with slow, deliberate precision, and when he unlocked it, the faint glow reflected. In his eyes, steady and focused, Nicole frowned, impatience breaking through her composure. "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be," she said. But her voice no longer carried the same certainty, because now there were too many eyes, too many questions forming without being spoken. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm, almost quiet, but it carried. "I am not making anything difficult," he said, glancing briefly at her before returning his gaze forward. "I am letting it happen." And that sentence landed differently, not as resistance, but as something controlled, something intentional. Mia's grip tightened on her phone as she heard it, because in that moment, she realized this was not a man being removed. This was a man allowing something to unfold, and that realization sent a subtle ripple through her chest. Nicole hesitated for half a second, just long enough for doubt to flicker, before turning sharply toward the cockpit, signaling for escalation. But what she did not know, what no one in that aisle fully understood yet, was that the moment she chose to push forward, she was no longer controlling the situation, she was accelerating it. And Marcus Carter, still seated in 2A, had already decided exactly how far this was going to go. Captain Daniel Pierce stepped into the aisle with the kind of authority that usually settled situations before they escalated. His uniform crisp, his expression firm. But the moment he looked at Marcus Carter, something in his gaze lingered just a fraction longer than expected, as if recognition tried to surface but could not quite reach the top. Nicole moved quickly beside him, her voice low but urgent, explaining just enough to frame the situation in her favor. "He is refusing to give up the seat for a priority passenger," she said, emphasizing the word priority like it justified everything that had already happened, and Daniel nodded slowly, turning his attention fully to Marcus, who remained seated, still, composed, as if the entire exchange was unfolding on his terms rather than theirs. "Sir," Daniel began, his tone controlled but firm, "I am going to need you to comply so we can avoid further disruption." And the word disruption hung in the air, heavy with implication, suggesting that Marcus was the problem simply by remaining where he was. Marcus lifted his eyes to meet the captain's, calm and unwavering, and for a brief moment, the two men held that look, one trying to assert control, the other already holding it. "I am not disrupting anything," Marcus replied evenly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the surrounding rows. "I am sitting in the seat assigned to me." And there was no tension in his tone, no urgency, just a quiet certainty that made the words land harder than if they had been shouted. Daniel exhaled slowly, shifting his weight, the pressure of the watching cabin beginning to register, because now there were too many eyes, too many phones subtly raised, too many passengers leaning in rather than turning away. Behind them, Richard Bennett shifted again, less confident now, his earlier composure beginning to crack under the growing attention, as if he suddenly realized that being handed the seat might come with a cost he had not considered. Nicole stepped forward again, her patience thinning. "There is no record of your assignment in our system," she said, her voice sharper now. And that sentence, more than anything else, caused a ripple through the cabin, because it did not sound like verification, it sounded like erasure. Mia Thompson's eyes widened slightly as she glanced toward the crew tablet in Nicole's hand, recalling the brief moment earlier when names had been adjusted too quickly, too quietly, and her fingers tightened around her phone, capturing every word, every shift, every inconsistency. Marcus tilted his head just slightly, not in confusion but in acknowledgement, as if he had been waiting for that exact claim. "That is interesting," he said calmly, his gaze steady on Nicole, "because it was there before you looked." And the precision of his response caused Daniel's brow to crease ever so slightly, doubt beginning to edge into his expression. The air in the cabin thickened again, no longer tense in a chaotic way, but focused, like a courtroom settling into the moment before something important is revealed. Daniel glanced briefly at Nicole, then back at Marcus, recalculating, but instead of stepping back, he doubled down. "Sir, if you do not comply, we will have to escalate this further," he said, though the authority in his voice now carried a trace of uncertainty. Marcus gave a small nod, almost approving, and reached down to his phone again, tapping the screen once, deliberate and precise, before speaking quietly. "Go ahead," he said, not looking at Daniel this time, but straight ahead, as if addressing something beyond the cabin itself. "Escalate it." And in that moment, the word shifted meaning entirely, no longer a threat against him, but a trigger for something much larger already set in motion, something the crew could not see, but was already beginning to close in around them. The aisle no longer felt like part of a plane. It felt like a line that had been drawn too far to step back from, and Captain Daniel Pierce could feel it now, the subtle shift from routine authority to something far less predictable, something watching him as much as he was watching Marcus Carter. Nicole stood beside him, arms tighter than before, her confidence beginning to show cracks not in what she said, but in how quickly she said it. Like she was trying to outrun the moment instead of control it. "We are following protocol," she insisted, her voice carrying just enough to reach the surrounding passengers. But it no longer landed with the same certainty, because now the word protocol sounded like a shield rather than a rule. Marcus remained seated, still grounded in a calm that did not belong to the situation they were trying to create. And as he glanced briefly down at his phone, the screen reflected something steady, deliberate, as if whatever he had just set in motion did not require urgency, only time. 2 rows back, a man lowered his laptop slowly, eyes fixed on the scene, while a woman beside him whispered, "This does not feel right." And that quiet sentence spread further than any announcement, because it gave shape to what others were already thinking but had not said. Near the galley, Mia Thompson shifted her stance, her training telling her to stay invisible, but her instincts pulling her forward inch by inch, because she had seen the system change too. Quickly, had heard the tone before the words, and now she was watching it unfold in real time, unable to ignore it anymore. Daniel straightened, trying to reclaim control of the moment. "Sir, I am asking you one final time," he said, though the emphasis on final felt forced, like he was convincing himself as much as Marcus. "Stand up and relocate." And the request hung there, heavier than before, because now it was not just an instruction, it was a test. Marcus lifted his eyes again, meeting Daniel's gaze with the same calm precision, and for a brief second, the noise of the cabin faded behind that exchange, 2 different kinds of authority facing each other, one worn on a uniform, the other carried without display. "You keep calling this relocation," Marcus said quietly, his voice even, controlled. "But what you are doing is removal," and the distinction landed sharply, because it stripped away the language they had been hiding behind, leaving the truth exposed in a way that could not be softened. Nicole inhaled sharply, stepping forward again as if proximity could restore control, but before she could speak, a soft chime echoed from her tablet, subtle but unmistakable, and her eyes flicked down for just a moment, confusion breaking through her expression as the screen refreshed without her input. Daniel noticed it too, the hesitation, the shift, and his posture changed ever so slightly, not retreating, but no longer advancing either. Marcus did not look at the tablet, did not react outwardly at all, but the timing was not lost on him, because he had seen this moment before, not here, not on this plane, but in boardrooms and negotiations where power revealed itself not through volume, but through control of the system itself. The cabin grew quieter again, but this time it was different, not tense, not chaotic, but focused, like everyone present understood that something had just changed, even if they could not yet see exactly what it was. Nicole's voice came back, softer now, edged with something new. "Captain," she said, not taking her eyes off the screen, "there is an update." And in that single word, update, the balance of the entire situation began to shift, because whatever had just entered their system was not part of their script, and Marcus Carter, still seated, still calm, had already moved the moment beyond anything they thought they were controlling. The word update did not belong in this moment, not in Nicole Harris's voice, not in the middle of a situation she had been controlling just seconds ago. And yet there it was, sitting in the air like something heavier than it should have been, because updates were not supposed to interrupt authority. They were supposed to support it. Nicole's eyes stayed locked on the tablet, her fingers hovering just above the screen as if touching it again might change what she was seeing, but it did not. The information remained clear, uninvited, and entirely out of her control. Captain Daniel Pierce leaned slightly closer, his voice lower now. "What kind of update?" he asked. But even before she answered, he could see it in her expression, the shift from certainty to confusion, from control to recalculation. Around them, the cabin had gone completely still, not silent in the absence of sound, but silent in the presence of attention, every passenger now watching openly, no longer pretending. This was a routine adjustment, because something had broken through the script. Marcus Carter did not look at the tablet, did not ask what had changed. He simply sat there, composed, as if he already knew, as if the moment unfolding was exactly where it was supposed to be. Nicole swallowed once before speaking, her voice quieter now, stripped of the edge it had carried before. "The system, it just refreshed," she said. But the words sounded incomplete, like she was trying to explain something she did not fully understand. And that uncertainty spread faster than any command she had given earlier. Daniel straightened slightly, his attention shifting from Marcus to the device. And for the first time since he stepped into the aisle, he hesitated, not outwardly, but enough for those watching to notice, because authority does not pause unless something forces it to. 2 seats away, a man leaned forward, whispering under his breath. "Now it is changing," and the sentence carried further than he intended, because it captured exactly what everyone was beginning to feel. Near the galley, Mia Thompson took a small step forward, no longer hiding the phone in her hand, her eyes fixed on the tablet as if she could read it from across the aisle, because whatever was on that screen mattered now more than anything being said. Nicole tapped once, then again, trying to navigate back, to confirm, to regain footing. But each movement only seemed to pull her further from control, and when she finally looked up, her gaze did not go to Marcus first. It went to Daniel, searching for direction she no longer had. Marcus exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of acknowledgement passing through his expression, not satisfaction, not triumph, just recognition, because the moment had reached the point where the system itself had begun to speak. "Is there still no record?" he asked calmly, not challenging, not pressing, simply placing the question into the space that had opened, and the weight of it settled immediately, because now the answer could not be shaped by assumption. It had to come from whatever had just appeared on that screen. Nicole's lips parted slightly, but for the first time since this began, she did not answer right away, and that silence, that hesitation, did more than any argument could have. It shifted the balance completely, because in that pause, everyone understood that the certainty she started with was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, the possibility that they had been wrong, and Marcus Carter, still seated, still composed, had not moved an inch. Yet the entire situation was beginning to move around him. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected, not empty but heavy, like the cabin itself was waiting for Nicole Harris to say something that would restore order. But the words did not come the way they had before, sharp and certain. They came slower now, uncertain, as she looked back down at the tablet and finally spoke. "There is a record," and the sentence barely left her lips before the meaning of it rippled outward, shifting everything at once. Captain Daniel Pierce's posture changed. Immediately, not dramatically, but enough for those watching to notice, because authority does not adjust unless it has to, and now it had to. His eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned in closer to read the screen for himself, confirming what Nicole had just said, and when he saw it, when the name was there, fully logged, fully verified, something in his expression tightened, not panic, but realization. 2 rows back, the same woman who had been whispering earlier let out a quiet breath. "I knew it," she said under her breath, but now she did not try to hide it, because the moment no longer belonged to the crew. It belonged to the truth unfolding in front of everyone. Richard Bennett, still standing just behind Nicole, shifted his weight again, his earlier confidence fading into something less certain, his eyes flicking briefly toward the tablet, as if hoping the update might somehow reverse itself. But it did not, and for the first time since he stepped forward, he did not move any closer to the seat. Marcus Carter remained exactly where he had been, hands resting calmly, posture unchanged, but the air around him felt different now, not because he had done anything outwardly, but because the situation had finally caught up to him. Instead of trying to push past him, Nicole swallowed, her grip on the tablet tightening slightly. "It shows confirmed assignment," she said, her voice quieter than before, and the words landed with a weight that could not be undone, because they contradicted everything she had said just moments earlier. Daniel straightened slowly, his attention shifting back to Marcus. But this time, there was something new in his gaze, something measured, something recalculating, because the narrative he had stepped into was no longer holding. Near the galley, Mia Thompson exhaled softly, the tension in her shoulders easing just enough to realize she had been holding it the entire time, her phone still recording, capturing the exact second the story changed. Marcus lifted his eyes again, meeting Daniel's gaze, calm and steady as before, but now there was no need to say anything, because the system had already spoken for him, had already corrected what words could not. Daniel glanced once more at the tablet, then back at Nicole, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, the understanding that this was no longer a matter of enforcement, but of consequence. The cabin, once tense with uncertainty, now leaned into a different kind of silence, one filled with anticipation, because everyone could feel it. The shift was complete, and whatever came next would not be about removing a passenger. It would be about answering for what had already been done, and Marcus Carter, still seated in 2A, had not raised his voice, had not stood up, had not argued, yet somehow, without moving at all, he had taken control of the entire plane. No one spoke right away, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said was already sitting there on that screen, undeniable, irreversible, and Captain Daniel Pierce felt it settle in his chest as he slowly straightened, the weight of command shifting into something far more complicated than control. Nicole Harris lowered the tablet, just slightly, as if bringing it closer to her body could somehow contain what it had revealed, but it did not, because the truth had already spread beyond her reach. Carried in the silence, reflected in the eyes of every passenger watching, Marcus Carter remained seated, exactly as he had been, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. But now there was something else around him, not visible, not spoken, but unmistakable, the kind of quiet authority that did not need to announce itself because it was already being recognized. "So there is a record," Daniel said finally, his voice no longer sharp, no longer edged with enforcement, but measured, careful, as if each word now had to pass through a different standard than before, and Nicole nodded once, the motion small but heavy. "Yes, Captain," confirmed, she replied, and the confirmation landed like a closing door, sealing off the version of events they had tried to hold on to. 2 seats away, someone shifted forward, no longer pretending to be uninvolved, while another passenger lowered their phone slowly, not because they were done recording, but because the moment had moved beyond disbelief into clarity. Richard Bennett cleared his throat again, but this time the sound did not carry confidence, it carried hesitation. And for the first time since this began, he stepped back instead of forward, creating distance between himself and the seat he had been so ready to claim. Marcus glanced briefly in his direction, not with judgment, not with confrontation, just a quiet acknowledgement, before returning his gaze to Daniel. And in that exchange, something subtle but undeniable shifted again. The understanding that the seat was never the real issue, it was the assumption behind it. Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that signals a decision forming, and he turned slightly toward Nicole, lowering his voice, but not enough to escape the awareness of the cabin. "We need to correct this," he said, and the word correct carried more than procedure, it carried consequence. Nicole's lips pressed together, her earlier certainty now replaced with something tighter, something more controlled, but no longer confident, and when she spoke, it was softer. "Understood," she said, though the word did not restore what had been lost. Near the galley, Mia Thompson took another step forward, no longer hiding, her phone still recording, but now her posture different, steadier, because the moment she had sensed earlier had arrived, the shift from assumption to accountability. Marcus leaned back slightly, not in relief, not in victory, but in completion of something he had already allowed to unfold, his voice calm as he finally spoke again. "This was never about moving seats," he said, and the sentence carried through the cabin with a clarity that no announcement could match. "It was about who you thought deserved to sit in them." And that was the moment the silence changed once more, not tense, not uncertain, but understood, because now everyone saw it, not just what happened, but why it happened. And as Daniel stood there, recalculating everything that had led to this point, he realized that the situation was no longer something to manage. It was something to answer for, and Marcus Carter, still seated in 2A, had already made sure that answer would not be optional. For a brief moment, no one moved, as if the entire cabin had been suspended in a single realization, and Marcus Carter felt it not as tension, but as something deeper, something familiar, the quiet echo of a moment he had lived before, long before this flight, long before this seat, when the setting was different but the judgment was the same. He was 25 then, standing in a polished office lobby in Chicago, wearing a press shirt, holding a portfolio filled with plans and projections that had taken him months to build, and across from him, a hiring manager had glanced at his resume, then at him, then back again, before saying, "We are looking for someone who fits the image of our brand." And the sentence had sounded professional, controlled, but the meaning beneath it had been unmistakable, because Marcus had understood even then that image was not about skill, it was about perception. And perception had already decided who he was before he had spoken a single word. He remembered walking out of that building, the weight of that moment settling in slowly, not as anger, but as clarity, because it was not the rejection that stayed with him, it was the pattern behind it, the quiet assumption that followed him into rooms he had earned the right to be in. Back in the present, seated in 2A, Marcus exhaled softly, the memory passing through him like a shadow that no longer held power, because everything that moment had taken from him had been rebuilt, multiplied, and reshaped into something far stronger than the approval he had once sought. Around him, the cabin remained still, but now the stillness felt different, not like uncertainty, but like recognition, as if the people watching were beginning to understand that what they had witnessed was not a single incident, but part of something larger, something that had existed long before this flight. Nicole Harris shifted her stance slightly, her earlier confidence replaced with a tighter, more controlled composure, while Captain Daniel Pierce stood just a step back from where he had been, his presence no longer pressing forward, but recalibrating, adjusting to a situation that no longer aligned with the assumptions. It began with, near the galley, Mia Thompson lowered her phone just enough to steady her grip, her eyes moving between Marcus and the crew, realizing that the story unfolding in front of her was not just about what had happened, but about why it had happened, and that realization carried a weight she had not expected when she first pressed record. Marcus lifted his gaze again, not to challenge, not to confront, but simply to be present in the moment that had now fully shifted around him. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, but it carried through the cabin with a clarity that cut deeper than anything raised in anger. "This is not new," he said, his eyes steady, his tone even. "It just feels new because this time, it did not go unnoticed." And that sentence settled into the space like a truth no one could argue with, because every person there had seen it, had felt it, had recognized it for what it was. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in acknowledgement, while Nicole's grip on the tablet eased just enough to reveal that the control she thought she held had already slipped away. Marcus leaned back slightly, not retreating, but grounding himself. Because this moment was not about proving who he was, it was about exposing what had already been revealed. And as the cabin remained locked in that quiet understanding, one thing became clear to everyone present. This was not the end of the situation, it was the turning point, the exact moment where everything that followed would no longer be guided by assumption, but by consequence. The air in the cabin no longer carried tension, it carried anticipation, the kind that settles in when something unresolved is about to be decided. And Marcus Carter felt it shift around him with quiet precision, not as pressure, but as confirmation that the moment had reached exactly where it needed to be. He glanced down at his phone once more, the screen still active, the line already open, and without raising his voice, without drawing attention, he spoke just clearly enough for the words to exist beyond him. Proceed, he said, a single word, controlled and deliberate, and somewhere far beyond the cabin. That word landed with immediate effect. Nicole Harris looked up sharply, the sound of it catching her off guard, because it did not belong to the dynamic she thought she understood, and for the first time since this began, she was not responding to him. She was reacting. Captain Daniel Pierce's gaze followed Marcus's movement, narrowing slightly as he processed not the word itself, but the confidence behind it, the absence of hesitation, the certainty that suggested this was not a request, but a signal. Near the galley, Mia Thompson felt a chill move through her shoulders, not from fear, but from realization, because the tone Marcus used was not one of someone trying to regain control. It was someone confirming that control had already been established. A soft vibration echoed from Nicole's tablet, then another, and then a sequence of alerts began to appear across the screen, not chaotic, but structured, each one layered with authority she had not seen before, and as her eyes scanned the updates, her posture shifted again, not just uncertain now, but unsettled. "Captain," she said, her voice quieter, pulling his attention fully back to the device, and Daniel stepped closer, his expression tightening as he read, each line unfolding with increasing clarity. Internal audit notification, live escalation flag, executive-level review, and then something that made him pause entirely, something that did not belong to routine operations, something that carried weight far beyond the cabin itself. Richard Bennett took another step back, his earlier presence now reduced to observation, his confidence replaced by distance, as if he understood without being told that whatever was happening no longer involved him. Marcus remained still, his hands relaxed, his posture unchanged, but the space around him had shifted completely, no longer defined by doubt or challenge, but by something undeniable, something that had moved beyond conversation into consequence. Daniel lifted his head slowly, his eyes moving from the tablet back to Marcus, and in that look, something fundamental had changed. The assumption was gone, replaced by recognition, not fully formed, but undeniable. "Sir," Daniel began, but the word came differently now, not as a command, not as an instruction, but as the beginning of something else, something closer to understanding. Marcus met his gaze calmly, not interrupting, not rushing, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it had been set in motion, because this was the point where everything aligned, where the system, the witnesses, and the truth itself converged into something that could no longer be ignored. Around them, the cabin remained still, every passenger aware that whatever came next would define not just what had happened, but how it would be answered. And as the quiet stretched just a little longer, Marcus spoke again, his voice steady, precise. "Now," he said, the words simple, but final, "we let the system speak." And in that moment, it was clear to everyone present that this situation was no longer being handled, it was being revealed. The word now did not echo, it settled, precise and irreversible. And for a brief second nothing happened, not outwardly, not visibly, but inside the system Nicole Harris was still holding. Something shifted with undeniable force, her tablet lighting again with a new sequence, not just notifications this time, but directives, structured, authoritative, and impossible to ignore. Captain Daniel Pierce leaned in closer, his eyes scanning faster now, the calm he had tried to maintain giving way to something sharper, something more aware, because the names appearing on the screen were not routine contacts. They were executive identifiers, compliance flags, internal audit references that did not activate unless something significant had already been triggered beyond the cabin. "What is this?" Daniel asked quietly, but the question was not directed at Marcus anymore. It was directed at the situation itself, at the unraveling of control that was happening in real time. Nicole did not answer immediately, her eyes moving across the screen, reading, rereading, as if hoping the words would rearrange into something less serious. But they did not, and when she finally spoke, her voice had changed completely, stripped of authority, edged with disbelief. "This is alive. Escalation, executive level," she said, and the phrase alone was enough to shift the air again, because even those who did not understand the system could feel the weight of those words. Marcus Carter remained seated, his expression unchanged, but there was a quiet finality in his posture now, Not anticipation, not tension, just completion, as if everything that needed to be set in motion had already been done. Richard Bennett lowered his gaze slightly, stepping further back into the aisle. No longer a participant, just a witness to something far beyond the seat he had been offered. Near the galley, Mia Thompson felt her breath steady, her phone still recording, capturing the exact second the situation moved from misunderstanding to accountability, her eyes fixed on the crew as they recalibrated in real time. Daniel straightened slowly, his attention returning to Marcus. But now the look in his eyes carried recognition, not fully spoken, but undeniable, because the pieces were aligning too clearly to ignore. The calm, the timing, the system response. None of it matched the profile they had assigned to him just minutes ago. "Sir," Daniel said again. But this time the word carried respect. Cautious and measured, replacing the authority it once held. "I need to understand what is happening." And the shift in tone did not go unnoticed, not by the passengers, not by Nicole, and certainly not by Marcus. Marcus lifted his gaze to meet Daniel's, steady as before, but now there was something else in it. Not revelation yet, but readiness, as if the moment they had been approaching had finally arrived. He did not rush to answer, did not fill the silence, allowing it to stretch just long enough for the weight of everything that had happened to settle fully into the space between them. And then, with the same calm precision he had carried from the beginning, he spoke, his voice low but clear. "You already have all the information you need," he said, his eyes briefly shifting toward the tablet before returning to Daniel. "You just have not accepted what it means yet." And that sentence landed deeper than anything before it, because it did not introduce new facts, it reframed everything they had already seen. The cabin remained still, but now the stillness carried a different energy, not anticipation, not confusion, but realization, the kind that arrives quietly and changes everything at once. And as Daniel stood there, processing not just the system in front of him, but the man sitting calmly in seat 2A, it became clear that the next words spoken would not just resolve the situation. They would define it entirely. The silence that followed Marcus Carter's words did not feel empty. It felt complete, like every assumption that had filled the cabin just minutes ago had been stripped away, leaving nothing but truth in its place. And Captain Daniel Pierce stood there for a moment longer than he intended, his eyes shifting once more to the tablet in Nicole Harris's hands, as if hoping for a different interpretation, a smaller explanation. But there was none. The system was clear, precise, and far beyond anything that could be dismissed. Nicole's grip on the tablet loosened slightly, her shoulders no longer squared with authority, but held in a controlled stillness, as if any sudden movement might make the situation worse. And for the first time since this began, she did not speak, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood that anything she said now would not carry the weight it once did. Marcus remained seated, his posture unchanged, but the space around him had shifted completely, no longer defined by challenge or doubt, but by recognition, the kind that does not need confirmation because it has already been accepted. Daniel exhaled slowly, the decision forming not as a command, but as an acknowledgement, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different tone entirely, steady, respectful, and measured. "Mr. Carter," he said, and the name landed in the cabin like a key turning in a lock, subtle but definitive, because it confirmed what had been building beneath the surface all along. A quiet ripple moved through the passengers, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, as heads turned slightly, as eyes widened just enough to register the shift. Because now it was no longer a question of who belonged in the seat. It was a question of how this had been allowed to happen at all. Near the galley, Mia Thompson lowered her phone just slightly, her breath catching for a moment, because the name alone carried weight she had not fully understood until now, and the realization settled in quickly. This was not just a passenger. This was someone the system itself recognized at a level far beyond standard protocol. Richard Bennett stepped back another half step, his presence now almost invisible, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by a quiet awareness that he had been standing in the middle of something he did not understand. Daniel straightened fully, his attention fixed on Marcus, and there was no hesitation left now, only clarity. "I apologize," he said, the words simple, direct, and entirely different from anything that had been said before, because they were not offered out of procedure. They were offered out of recognition. Nicole lowered her gaze slightly, the weight of the moment settling over her, her earlier certainty now replaced with something quieter, something more reflective, as if she was replaying every decision she had made in the last few minutes and realizing how each one had led directly to this point. Marcus met Daniel's gaze, calm as ever, but now there was something else there, not satisfaction, not victory, but resolution, because this was not about being right. It was about being seen clearly, without assumption, without distortion. "You did not need to know my name," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady, carrying just enough to reach beyond the aisle. "You just needed to treat me like I belonged." And that sentence settled into the cabin with a weight that no system, no update, no authority could override, because it addressed not just what had happened, but why it had happened. And as the silence returned once more, it was no longer uncertain, it was understood, and in that understanding, the entire cabin shifted, not back to what it was before, but forward into something that could not be undone. The apology did not end the moment. It deepened it, because once the truth had been spoken, once the name had been recognized, the question was no longer what had happened, it was what would be done about it. And Captain Daniel Pierce understood that as clearly as anyone in the cabin, his posture steady but no longer defensive, his authority no longer about control but about accountability. He turned slightly toward Nicole Harris, and for the first time since this began, there was no ambiguity. In his expression, no room for interpretation, only decision, and when he spoke, his voice carried that clarity. "We are correcting this immediately," he said, each word measured, deliberate, and final. Nicole nodded once, the motion small but heavy, her earlier confidence now replaced with something quieter, something grounded in the realization of what had unfolded, and she stepped back from the aisle, creating space where before she had tried to take it, her movements controlled, careful, as if each action now needed to be aligned with something greater than her own judgment. Richard Bennett lowered his gaze and stepped fully away from the seat, no longer lingering, no longer waiting, understanding without being told that the place he had been offered was never his to take, and the distance he created spoke louder than anything he could have said. Marcus Carter remained seated, his presence unchanged, but now the entire cabin seemed to orient around him differently, not with tension, not with uncertainty, but with recognition, the kind that shifts a room without a single raised voice. Near the galley, Mia Thompson lowered her phone slightly, her shoulders easing as the moment transitioned from confrontation to consequence, her eyes still fixed on the scene, knowing she had witnessed something that extended beyond a single flight. Daniel turned back to Marcus, his tone steady, respectful, and clear. "Your seat is confirmed, and this situation will be formally reviewed," he said, but the words carried more than procedure. They carried acknowledgement, the understanding that what had happened could not simply be corrected, it had to be addressed. Nicole glanced once more at the tablet, then lowered it completely, no longer using it as a tool of authority, but holding it as a record of what had just taken place, her silence now more telling than any statement she could have made. Marcus met Daniel's gaze, calm as ever, and gave a small nod, not as acceptance of the apology alone, but as recognition that the moment had reached its necessary point, that the truth had been seen and could not be undone. "Make sure it is reviewed," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady, not demanding, not emotional, but precise, "not because of me, but because this does not start or end with one seat." And the sentence carried through the cabin with a weight that settled deeper than any directive, because it shifted the focus from the individual to the pattern, from the moment to the system behind it. The passengers remained still, not out of discomfort, but out of understanding, because what they had witnessed was no longer just an incident. It was a reflection of something larger, something that had now been brought into the open. Daniel nodded once, firm and certain. "It will be," he said, and in that exchange, something final took shape, not the end of the situation, but the beginning of its consequences, and as the cabin slowly began to breathe again, returning to motion without returning to what it had been, one thing remained clear to everyone present. This flight had changed, not in destination, not in schedule, but in awareness, and that was something no system could quietly reset. The cabin did not return to what it had been before, not fully, because something had shifted too deeply to be undone. And even as passengers slowly settled back into their seats, as quiet conversations resumed in low tones, there was a new awareness woven into the air, something unspoken but shared, like everyone had witnessed a line that could no longer be ignored. Marcus Carter remained seated in 2A, calm and grounded. His presence no longer questioned, no longer challenged, but understood, in a way that did not require explanation. And as he looked out toward the narrow window beside him, the clouds drifting below felt distant, almost symbolic, because everything that mattered had already happened inside this cabin. Nicole Harris stood a step back now, her posture composed but changed, no longer projecting authority, but carrying the weight of reflection, her earlier certainty replaced with something quieter, something more aware. And though she said nothing, the shift in her presence spoke clearly enough. Captain Daniel Pierce returned to the front of the cabin, his movements steady, his expression focused, but there was a difference in the way he carried himself, a recalibration not just of the situation, but of what it meant to lead within it, because authority, once tested, does not return unchanged. Near the galley, Mia Thompson finally lowered her phone completely, her fingers relaxing around it as she took a slow breath, realizing that what she had recorded was more than an incident. It was a moment of clarity, one that would not disappear once the plane landed, one that would continue beyond this flight. A few rows back, the woman who had whispered earlier glanced toward Marcus again, then nodded slightly to herself, as if confirming something she had always known but had just now seen unfold in real time. Richard Bennett remained quiet, seated now. His earlier presence faded into the background, not out of embarrassment alone, but out of understanding, because the moment had shown him something he could not unsee. Marcus leaned back slightly, not in relief, not in triumph, but in stillness, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to prove. And after a brief pause, he spoke once more, his voice low, steady, carrying just enough to reach beyond his row. "Power is not about who gets the seat," he said, his gaze forward, his tone even. "It is about how you treat someone when you think they do not deserve it." And the sentence settled into the cabin with quiet force, not dramatic, not loud, but lasting, because it reframed everything that had happened in a way no system update ever could. No one responded right away, not because they disagreed, but because the truth of it did not need a response. It needed reflection. And as the aircraft continued its path through the sky, steady and unchanged in direction, the people inside it were not the same as they had been before. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, not to rest, but to center himself in the aftermath of a moment that had never been about him alone. And when he opened them again, the cabin was calm, the flight continuing as scheduled, but the meaning of what had happened remained, quiet, undeniable, and far from finished.